Demos una cordial bienvenida al Dr. Matthew Larsen, quien nos hablará de los estudios sobre la biodiversidad.
Muchas gracias. Y durante el break, Luis y yo estaba haciendo broma de cuántas personas va a estar aquí. Yo pensé que va a estar aquí 3 gatos y veo más de 3 gatos. Muchas gracias por quedar, porque sé que yo soy aquí estoy en el último, la posición última y entre ustedes y el tranque, o quizás ustedes y el happy hour. Entonces, ninguna alternativa es buena para mí, pero de todo modo, muchas gracias Luis para su trabajo valiente con esa cuestión de los hongos en café y chocolate, porque entre esos 2 productos yo sé que no puedo vivir, ni mi esposa tampoco, entonces algo bastante importante. Entonces, hablando de eso, no sé si ustedes vieron en la noticia de hoy, la compañía de Mars Chocolate tenía que hacer un recall a 55 países de sus productos de chocolate que viene de Netherlands por algún defecto en pedacito de plástico en el chocolate. Entonces, algo bastante serio para una compañía tan grande y es obviamente un producto de importancia global. Bueno, voy a convertir a inglés ahora porque una lástima que preparé toda la charla en inglés y si yo mezclo los idiomas voy a sufrir más que ustedes. Eso es el mecanismo aquí. So I'm going to talk about recent work at the Smithsonian, and as you know, we have a dual role here in Panama and in other countries, mainly in the U.S., for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, so both to do research but also to provide educational opportunities to the public. And of course here we've modified the original statement of James Smithson, who started our institution in the 1800s with a donation to the government of the United States to focus on tropical biodiversity. And here is an early picture of Lago Gatún before it was completely filled, when Smithsonian scientists first came to do some assessments of environmental impacts of the canal construction. That led to greater interest and presence of scientists from the Smithsonian and other institutions here. And these photos were taken at Isla Barro, Colorado. I have a quiz for you. If you look at the top photo, and the first director is in that photo, y que alguien sabe cuál puede ser el director en esa foto. There's a piece of clothing evidence that will tell you. Anybody have a guess? All right, I won't make you wait. Who wears a tie? ¿Quién usa una corbata en el bosque? Oye, el señor ahí es el primer director, James Zitek, y en ese calor y humedad de Barro Colorado, una corbata es una pesadilla, oye. If we fast forward to Omar Torrijos and Jimmy Carter signing the treaty, por fin, in 1997, this changed the status of the Smithsonian and La Isla, our first major research station, and made it into a nature monument. So this is where a lot of the early work was done and continues to be done. This is probably one of the best studied pieces of tropical forest in the world. On average, the Smithsonian here in Panama produces a peer-reviewed scientific paper about every 20 hours. So about 400 a year through our scientists and also our many collaborators, many of whom are now at places like INDICASAT and other universities in the country and around the world. Panama is obviously an important place to study tropical biodiversity because of the bridge between 2 continents and the barrier between 2 seas, and you know as much about that as I do, so I'm not going to go into detail. But here's a very important pair of numbers. The great majority of the major universities in the world are in the temperate environment, and yet most of the biodiversity in the world is here in the tropics. So we have a big disconnect between the research capacity around the world and where the subject to be studied is located. So STRI, Smithsonian here in Panama, creates or provides a platform for a variety of research to be conducted. This is our network of stations and locations around the country. Much of it was originally in the former canal zone, which is why we're heavily located there, but we've since expanded around the country. And hopefully many of you have been to most of our locations, and if not, please send me a note and so we can invite you to visit. We do a variety of types of research, and I'll go into some examples, but I just thought I'd show you some images of some of our researchers who conduct a range of studies, from Rachel Collin working in marine biology out at Bocas del Toro down to the lower right, Carlos Jaramillo, who is working on paleontology and has had a number of studies focused on the canal expansion areas that provide a number of new exposures to allow us to look back in time at the history of the isthmus as it rose. Clearly, we do much work, and there are many complex biological systems here. Leafcutter ants, for example, I joke with people from the United States. They've been around for tens of millions of years, and they have very complex systems for managing the fungal crops that they grow from the cut leaves. In fact, they had the Affordable Care Act long before the U.S. Congress approved it in the United States under President Obama. They have a remarkable system of managing their diseases and preventing them. A key question in the tropics is why are there so many trees and why such great diversity? And we launched in 1980 something called the Center for Tropical Forest Science on a 50-hectare plot on the island, and started studying and marking every single tree in a 50-hectare area. That's 200,000 individual trees bigger than this diameter, and over 300 species of trees. And this work has yielded a number of fascinating insights, including, as you can see here, from the different types of trees, the large variety range in the frequency of species. So some trees are highly abundant, others are barely there at all, and this is a puzzle for tropical forest ecologists. If you take if you take a similar 50-hectare plot in the upper Amazon of Ecuador, there are more different species of trees in that 50 hectares in Ecuador than there are in the entire global temperate forest system of the world. So it attests to the remarkable diversity that we have here in the tropics. So this particular experiment has been so successful now that there are over 60 forest plots around the world, including the one I mentioned in Ecuador, in 24 different countries with over 80 different partner institutions. The Smithsonian does not pay for this work, but we collaborate and coordinate and assure a common data standard so that the same types of data are collected and made available to researchers around the world. Another major study is our canal watershed program. We call it Agua Salud for one of the watersheds in that basin. And this looks at ecosystem services. As you probably know, the canal watershed is probably the best example of a set of ecosystem services in the world. The shipping through the canal generates $2 billion a year in gross revenue. Half of that goes into the national treasury, 9,000 direct jobs, 200,000 related jobs, half the public water supply, half the electrical supply for the country. So the canal is a major economic driver for the country, and maintaining that watershed, which is 50% forested at present, is critical for the nation. A few examples from some of our work, and I told you I wouldn't be long because I know it's late. So one of the very recent studies that was just released is this project that describes how secondary forests accumulate carbon. It was thought for many years that as trees age, and particularly in secondary forests, the carbon sequestration is not very important, but it turns out that was wrong, and this network of forest plots allows us to demonstrate that they're accumulating carbon at a much higher rate. This is critically important for reducing CO2 levels in the atmosphere, which are now causing global warming. It's not going to solve the problem, but it will help us mitigate the problem. Another product that just was released from our Agua Salud study is a new multi-chapter handbook for managing tropical forests. One of the findings in this study was that teak forest, we've long known doesn't do very well on degraded soils, but it turns out that Dalbergia retusa, cocobolo, does extremely well, much better than teak on degraded soils, and it may prove to be a much better tree to reforest degraded soil areas, particularly in light of President Varela's interest in reforesting 1 million hectares across the country. One of our studies, here's Klaus Winter in a greenhouse looking at future temperatures and CO2 levels to see how plants respond. This is important as we face increasing stresses on plants, and we need to understand how they will respond to changing climate in the future. One day, Dolores Piperno, an archaeologist, and Klaus were at lunch, and she said, well, what if we looked back in time using those greenhouses? So they did another experiment where they lowered the temperature, lowered the CO2 level to what it would have been 10,000 years ago when humans were just beginning to cultivate crops. And they Dolores used it to look at a plant called teosinte, which is a precursor of corn. And so corn, if you look at teosinte now, you would think, why would anyone use this? The kernels are tiny, it doesn't show any hope. But in the Holocene, 10,000 years ago, teosinte actually appears as a much more robust plant, and you can understand how humans would adapt that and eventually evolve it into what we now know as corn, a major food crop around the world. We all know about the golden frog, and a number of our scientists are working on the preservation of this amphibian. It's not been seen in the wild, tragically, since 2007 because something called the chytrid fungus. But as this fungus was moving through Central America in the early 2000s, late 1990s, a number of scientists collected specimens from the wild and have them now in quarantine facilities. So in Gamboa, El Valle, we have sites where we have a number of amphibians protected from the environment, protected from chytrid, and there is enough genetic diversity in those populations that we hope we can either figure out what the frogs need to do to survive the chytrid, or perhaps develop techniques that we can use to inoculate these animals so they can be reintroduced into the wild. We would hate to lose a national symbol of Panama. One thing that's amusing about this photo, you know that the rana dorada makes a call to attract females, the male does this, and ward off other males, but they come from noisy environments. If you've been to El Valle, you know there's waterfalls, there's cascades, so their call isn't always heard. So the males practice a behavior called semaphore, so they're waving. And so guys, just think, si está en un bar y una mujer muy bonita entra y tú estás gritando, oye, aquí estoy, pero ella no oiga nada porque es muy ruidoso en el bar, entonces tiene que mover la mano así, y entonces ella quizá va a verte. That's the same thing with the golden frog, so you gotta love it. Another study that we're now doing is looking at vampire bat behavior. And if you go on the web right now, you Google VampCam, you will see live feed of vampires out in Gamboa in an enclosure where some of our scientists are studying their behaviors. It turns out that vampires are very communally oriented. They share food with each other. If one vampire can't go out and feed, other vampires approach it and they feed it. It's almost dinner time, so I'll tell you how they do it. They regurgitate blood into the mouth of the other vampire. Buen provecho a todo. But it turns out they do this not only within their kinship, their direct bloodlines, but to strangers or non-kin in the group. So it's quite remarkable they have this collective behavior, and it's not very well understood. You may know that there are only 3 species of vampire in the world, and we've got them all right here in Panama. So, another example of some recent work achieved by some of our scientists and our collaborators is a new species of a river dolphin. This was just documented in the past year or so based on fossils. And I'm particularly proud to say that it was a student at the University of Panama, Dioselina Vigil, who actually discovered the fossil and is written up in the record for documenting this first river dolphin that was discovered here. If we fast forward a little bit here, we've just learned some new information based on archaeological data for hunting of dolphins that looks like it occurred in the Islas Perlas by the early Panamanians about 6,000 years ago or so. This is preliminary work, but it's already been published. Richard Cook is one of the authors of this study. So fascinating new insights into how the early humans in Central America and Panama survived. Here's another example of a Panamanian student who was the first to document Rodolfo Flores, a new plant. And this is one of just an example of why it's so important to maintain biodiversity. There's so much that we don't know. We don't know what properties this plant might have. It may not have any that are useful to humans in the near term, but if we lose forests, we lose biodiversity, we run the risk of missing out on important opportunities to develop new medicines, new drugs to treat a variety of illnesses, many of which we've been hearing about today. One example of this is the fungal types that grow on sloths. So a collaborator and her led a team, Sarah Higginbotham led a team a couple of years ago to take hair trimmings from 9 sloths. The sloths were not hurt, little haircut, and they go back in the tree. And 80 different fungal types were identified on the sloth and tested for medical properties. And remarkably, 3 of them showed unusual bioactivity, one against the malarial parasite, another fungus showed bioactivity against gram-negative bacteria, and yet another showed, and this was most surprising to me, bioactivity against the human breast cancer cell. So a remarkable characteristic that, that's carried around by this sloth, host to many different types of fungus, ongles. We humans probably had many of these fungus too when we lived in the canopy before we came down as early as primates, and even well beyond. Nowadays we take too many showers, so the fungus don't get to grow and we lose that opportunity. But the sloths still have it. Another thing that we're particularly proud of from last year is our scientist Hector Guzman and Juan Mate, I think Juan is still here, participated in development of 2 marine protected areas, one on each side of the isthmus. And the president and Mireya Ndara, you can see there, signed this decree a few months ago to protect large amounts of offshore marine territory, important for the conservation of species in the offshore areas. And then last example is about science being policy relevant. That's not our main focus at the Smithsonian, but it's always important when our science is used for policy. And so many of you may know Hector Guzman, who's a studies marine mammals. And he was looking at female behavior of humpback whales in the Gulf of Panama, and looking at, you can see the colored lines winding all around. Those are the tracks of radio-collared or radio-tagged whales in their feeding each winter. And as you can see, and he noticed, they intersected with the ship tracks coming out of the canal. So Hector looked at this for a while, looked at their paths, and realized that if we were able to track the ships into a narrow corridor until they diverged outside the Gulf, we could reduce the impact on humpback whales by about 90%. So there he is, very proudly, with a map that was adopted by the International Maritime Organization in 2014, and now all shipping during the mating season is required to follow that track until they get outside the Gulf, and then they can diverge. So this is a major advancement for the whales. It's also not too hard on the shipping companies because they don't really want to hit the whales, pay the fines, damage their propellers, and it's a minor adjustment to their courses. So this is a great example of how science can inform policy and both sides can win in the end. Lastly, I'll just close with the importance of education and training the next generation of scientists. So we have about 1,300, 1,500 visiting scientists every year who come from around the world to work at STRI to do their undergraduate studies, graduate and postdoctoral studies. Something that we're very proud of. People come from 50 different countries around the world, many, of course, right here in Panama. And lastly, it's important to educate the public. And one example I like to give is Ana Patricia Betancourt Bernal. She's a daughter of one of our staff. And one day she was in the backyard looking at a guandú plant right there. And she saw these little bugs on it. And she said, Mommy, ¿qué es eso? And Mommy came out and said, we got to get rid of them. They're going to eat our bean plant. So, but she said, no, ¿qué es eso? What is it? You know, so we have an entomologist at our office, Annette Ayello. And so Mom took some little samples of the bugs into the office. And it turns out that Ana Patricia had discovered a new invasive species in Panama. It had never been documented here. This was in La Prensa some months ago. So she's very proud now and has her name in the publication, even though she's only about 7 years old. In a new publication to document this invasive species that came from Asia. Very important discovery, because if we can control it before it spreads, it will help protect this vital crop. So I'm going to stop there because I said it's late, and I appreciate you staying till the very end. And I have to say, I've been here now in Panama for 2 years, coming from Washington, and I really have enjoyed the warm, caluroso cariño que he tenido de la comunidad de Panamá aquí en La Patria. Entonces, muchas gracias por la hospitalidad y la amistad que yo he visto en todo lado, en esa comunidad académica y en la comunidad científica aquí. Bueno, gracias.